Everything was fine until I turned 11. My name is Jacqueline. Back then, I lived with my parents in a cozy two-story house. There was nothing special about it: simple light, colored walls, wooden floors, a soft sofa in the living room, smelling of lavender from Mom's scented candles, but it was home. Here I knew every corner, every step that creaked treacherously under my feet, and every unevenness on the wallpaper in my room. Mom and Dad seemed happy, at least in the eyes of the child, who had not yet learned to distinguish between genuine joy and the polite smile of adults hiding cracks in their marriage. The divorce came as a surprise, although it passed quietly, without shouting, without broken plates and recriminations. No dramas that you see so often in movies or hear in the stories of friends. It's nothing like what my friend Jenny went through when her parents couldn't even be in the same room without starting to raise their voices. One day, the day just came when Dad packed up his tools, put some shirts and jeans in a suitcase, came up to me, hugged me tightly, hugged me, stroked my back and said, "I'll always be there for you, princess." And then he left. Mom was coping, or so it seemed. When Dad's money orders arrived in the mail, she rolled her eyes, opened the envelope with a sharp sigh, and muttered to herself something like, "Well, is that enough?" But that was the end of it. She didn't cry, she didn't scold him, she didn't tell me he was a bad person. I just put the envelope on the kitchen table and didn't mention it anymore. I saw Dad on the weekend. He rented a small apartment above an auto repair shop, and it always smelled of engine oil, coffee, and slightly burnt toast because he could never get the temperature on his old toaster oven right. But I loved being there. We had breakfast together on a narrow balcony, ate bacon and eggs and drank cocoa, chatted about school, drew funny faces on fogged windows and assembled model airplanes, although most of the time they remained half-finished. So a year passed. And then Mom met Richard. Richard was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a confident smile and an expensive watch on his wrist. He spoke in an even voice, never interrupted my mother, and smiled at me with polite curiosity, as if trying to guess if we would make friends. He had 2 daughters, Sarah and Emma, both a couple of years younger than me. When my mom first told me they were engaged, her eyes shone like Christmas lights. She took my hands, squeezed them in her warm palms and, restraining the tremor in her voice from excitement, whispered, "Just think about it, honey. You'll have sisters. We're going to be a real family again. Richard is a wonderful man, and his girls are so cute. You'll like it, you'll see." I remember nodding, caught up in her joy, sincerely believing that this would be the beginning of something wonderful. Since childhood, I've dreamed of sisters, of someone with whom I could share secrets, watch movies at night, make popcorn in the microwave, discuss teachers, books, music, and dream about the future. Mom talked about it for hours. She painted in my mind the perfect picture of our new life: cozy family evenings, board games at the round table, walks together, laughter and support. The wedding was small, but sweet. I wore a pale blue dress, carrying a basket of flowers as I walked down the aisle, while Sarah and Emma chirped behind me in matching pink outfits, exchanging glances and giggling every now and then. I tried to catch their eyes, hoping that they would include me in their secret jokes, but every time I made eye contact with them, they quickly turned away. The night before they moved in, I couldn't sleep because of the excitement. I cleaned my room, made room in the closet, put small towels on the bathroom shelf, left postcards with painted hearts for them, and my mother helped me arrange bouquets of fresh daisies in their rooms. "You see, you're already such a good sister," she said, kissing my forehead. If only I had known what was going to happen next, maybe I would have told Dad more than just the on-duty, "It's okay." Perhaps I would have looked at this marriage differently, maybe even tried to stop it. But I was 11. And I believed in fairy tales about happy mixed families. It took exactly 3 days for my fairy tale to turn into a nightmare. On the 4th morning after they moved in, I woke up to the feeling that something had changed in the house. The air became different, tense, dense, as before a thunderstorm. I heard footsteps in the hallway, the creak of a door, and muffled laughter. I went downstairs to the kitchen and saw Sarah and Emma sitting at the table, chatting and eating my favorite strawberry flakes that Mom bought just for me. I froze in the doorway. "Hey, these are my—" I began, but Sarah, without looking up, casually shrugged her shoulders. "They're ours now." Emma nodded, smiling. At that moment, I realized that the place that had always been my home no longer belonged to me. I woke up early, as usual, to get ready for school, but when I went to the bathroom door, I found it locked, even though no one was usually there at that time. I knocked, gently at first, then harder, but all I heard in response was a rustle and a soft chuckle. Sarah and Emma were inside. Just a minute after I knocked, Sarah intoned, "Just a second," and that second stretched into 45 minutes. I kept knocking, reminding her that I had to get ready too, that I would be late for school, but all I heard in response was giggling, the sound of a running hair dryer and splashing water. When the door finally opened, they came out, dressed identically, with perfectly coiffed hair and satisfied grins. "Beauty takes time," Emma remarked as she walked past me, with exaggerated pity in her voice. "You should know that." "Oh, wait, maybe you don't know?" Sarah giggled, and they went off to breakfast without looking at me. I rushed to the bathroom, realizing that I only had a few minutes left to get myself in order, and while I was hastily brushing my teeth, I heard the school bus pull up. I had to run out of the house without even brushing my hair, buttoning my jacket as I walked, while Sarah and Emma were already boarding the bus, discussing something funny and clearly not paying any attention to me. That's how our new morning routine began. They occupied the bathroom for as long as they wanted, while I waited, was late or in a hurry, and no one seemed to consider it a problem. But the bathroom was just the beginning. That evening, as usual, I went to my place at the dining table next to my mother, but found that it was already occupied by Sarah. I opened my mouth to protest, but Mom didn't even let me finish. "Jacqueline, honey, why don't you sit there?" she said and pointed to a chair at the far end of the table, away from her, closer to the edge. "It's just a chair, don't make a fuss." I watched as Mom tenderly cut the meat for Sarah and Emma, asked if they wanted more juice, straightened their napkins and cleared their plates from the table, as she used to do for me. Richard beamed with emotion as he watched this scene while I silently picked at my food. Things got even worse when Sarah noticed my collection of hairpins, which Mom and I picked out together during our weekly shopping trips. "Oh my God, Emma, look at them!" she exclaimed, taking out my favorite butterfly pins. "They would look much better on us." "They're mine," I said indignantly, reaching out to take them, but Mom just shook her head and said in a tone that brooked no argument, "Girls have to share, Jacqueline. Don't be greedy. Sarah and Emma are your sisters now." After that, they started calling me Greedy Jacqueline whenever the adults didn't hear. But the ridicule wasn't enough for them. My textbooks were used as if they were unnecessary notebooks, the pages were torn and crumpled, my clothes were accidentally stained with nail polish, and homework regularly disappeared, only to float up in the trash, all crumpled and stained with something sticky. Every time I tried to tell my mom, she shook her head with a tired expression on her face. "Jacqueline, stop trying to get attention. I know it's hard for you, but making up stories about your sisters is not the way to deal with it. They're not my sisters." I lost my temper one day when I found my favorite sweater with a huge hole in the sleeve. But instead of taking my side, Mom just took a deep breath, and Richard said in his always calm but cold voice, "Jacqueline, you should be grateful for your family." These words, which should have sounded like encouragement, instead sounded like a sentence. But the final blow came a week later, when Mom announced that there would be a small reshuffle. "Sarah and Emma need more space for their stuff," she explained without looking me in the eye. "Your room has better cupboards, so they'll take it. We've already moved your things to the small room next to the laundry room." The small room turned out to be something like a large storage room with a window. It barely held my bed and dresser, and when I saw my things piled haphazardly in that tiny corner, it took my breath away. Something inside me snapped as I stood in the middle of this tiny room, surrounded by piles of my belongings, thoughtlessly piled up, as if I had been relocated not as a family member, but as a temporary guest who at any moment would have to make room for someone more important. It wasn't just about the room, the cupboards, or the window that barely let in light through the narrow gap between the neighboring buildings. It was about my place in this family, or rather, the complete absence of it. But as it turned out, it wasn't enough for Richard that his daughters constantly bullied me. He wasn't going to stay away himself. Even the most insignificant thing I did wrong, instantly became proof of my complexity, my depravity, my supposedly bad character. If I was silent at dinner, it meant I was sulking. If I talked, I became destructive. If I spent time in my room, I moved away from my family. If I stayed late with friends, I did not show proper respect for the house. I couldn't win this game because the rules were constantly changing, and the judge who decided my fate wasn't even trying to appear objective. "Just like your father," Richard said, looking at me with an expression of deep disappointment, as if I had chosen to become what he saw me to be. I always caused problems. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it? The funny thing was that Dad, despite everything, was doing quite well. His car repair shop, specializing in the repair of expensive cars, slowly but surely gained momentum, and although it was difficult at first, he gradually earned himself an excellent reputation. Clients returned to him, advised his friends, and I saw how he became more confident every day, even if the fatigue of long working hours left shadows under his eyes. But I never told Richard about it. Let him think what he wants. The weekend I spent with my father was my salvation. We ordered pizza, watched old movies, and sometimes he told me stories about the cars he worked on, about strange and demanding customers, and about rare models that fell into his hands. Sometimes I just sat in his office while he was doing paperwork, enjoying the silence that I missed so much at home. "How are you, princess?" "What is it?" he asked sometimes. "Great," I always replied, unable to bring myself to tell the truth. He had enough worries. He worked tirelessly, building a business from scratch, and the last thing he needed was to worry about me. The years dragged on, and I threw myself into my studies. Any opportunity to stay late at school, hide in the library, spend time with friends, just not to come home earlier than necessary, was a salvation for me. High school flew by like that, and before I knew it, graduation was approaching. I applied to several colleges, received letters of acceptance, and when I received confirmation that I had been accepted into the business program of the university I dreamed of, it seemed to me that I would finally be able to break free, start over, leave behind this house, this family, in which I was not there was room. The day after graduation, at dinner, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. We were all sitting at the table, and I steeled myself, pulled out the letters of enrollment, and said with restraint, but with excitement. I was accepted to several colleges. I was even offered partial scholarships. I was waiting for a reaction, hoping that at least Mom would smile, say something, that maybe I would hear at least a tiny hint of pride in her voice. Instead, Richard's laughter broke the silence. Not good-natured, not joyful, no. It was that mocking laugh that sounded when a person was not even considered worthy of a serious answer. "And who's going to pay for it?" His voice was filled with cold contempt. "Is your father a loser? That pathetic mechanic who can barely keep afloat with his garage?" I felt something constrict in my chest. The letters suddenly became too heavy in my hands. "I have scholarships," I replied, trying to keep my voice level, "and I can take out a student loan." "Don't be ridiculous," he interrupted, waving me off as if I were saying something ridiculous. "We will not jointly sign any loans for you." I looked at my mom, hoping that she would finally step in, say something, that she wouldn't just let him ruin my future, that no matter what, she was still my mother. But she didn't look at me, didn't look up from her plate, and when she finally spoke, her voice sounded low, almost indifferent. "Richard's right, dear. We need to think about the girl's future." It took me a moment to realize what she had just said. About the girl's future? I repeated, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "We're saving up for Sarah and Emma's education," Richard continued, his voice completely calm, even bored. Something inside me snapped. All these years of neglect, pain, rejection, all the suppressed emotions, all the anger accumulated over the years that I spent trying to earn their attention, suddenly burst out. "You haven't even looked at me in years," I shouted, pushing away from the table. "All you care about is pleasing your precious husband and his perfect daughters. When was the last time you asked how I was doing? When was the last time you acted like my mother instead of their stepmother?" The silence that followed was deafening, as if the sound of that blow had taken all the air out of the room, and for a moment the world around me froze, shrunk to a single point where my cheek burned, burning from the slap. It took me a moment to realize what had just happened, that the hand that was supposed to comfort, protect, and love had come crashing down on me with a force that made my head buzz. My mother. My own mother slapped me in the face. The pain from the blow was negligible compared to the pain from what I saw when I looked up. Sarah and Emma did not hide their delight, their eyes shone with amusement, their lips curved into smug smiles, as if they had just witnessed the funniest performance of their lives. And Richard was sitting there with his arms crossed over his chest, with such a satisfied grin, as if he had been waiting for this moment from the very beginning, as if this was the inevitable proof of his correctness, the triumphant confirmation of all those words that he so often said about my complexity, about my problematic, about the fact that I was such a just like my father. I touched my cheek, feeling the heat spreading over my skin, but even hotter was the flame inside me, spreading across my chest, filling my lungs, ready to burst out. I expected anything but this. Mom just stood there, breathing heavily, her hands still raised, as if she didn't believe what she had done, anger and something else mixed in her eyes. Shock? Remorse? Or maybe it's relief that now I finally understand my place. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned around and, without saying another word, rushed into my tiny room, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking, but I didn't allow myself to think, I didn't allow myself to cry. I just started grabbing things, throwing them indiscriminately into the suitcase, clothes, a few photos, a couple of books, my few remaining precious things that Sarah and Emma had not yet managed to spoil or appropriate for themselves. I heard movement in the house, the clatter of a plate on the table, footsteps in the hallway, my mother's soft voice, but no one came to me, no one knocked, no one tried to stop me, no one apologized. When I walked out the door, it felt like I wasn't even breathing. I drove about a block before the adrenaline started to wear off, and then reality hit me. I was 18, I had no money, no plan, and nowhere to go. I froze on the sidewalk, my fingers gripping the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and before I could change my mind, I dialed the number. "Hello, princess. How are you?" Dad's voice was so ordinary, so warm, that my knees almost buckled. I took a deep breath to keep from bursting into tears. "Can you pick me up?" "Of course. Where are you?" 15 minutes later, a black Mercedes pulled up next to me. For a moment, I thought I'd given him the wrong address. There was no way this car could be his, but then the window rolled down and I saw his smile. "Do you like my new car?" "What is it?" he asked, coming out to help me with my suitcase. I stared at him, unable to believe it. "Is this yours?" "I thought it was a customer's car." He laughed. His warm, native laugh was like a breath of fresh air for me after a long stay underwater. "No, baby, it's mine. I bought it last week. Things are going well." It was only then that he noticed the suitcase in my hands, and his expression instantly changed. "Jacqueline, what happened? Why are you here with a suitcase?" And then it all came out. I told him everything. About college, about how Richard had laughed at me, about my mom's betrayal, about the slap in the face, about how I packed my things while no one even tried to stop me. His face darkened with every word, and his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "I'm going there right now," he growled, already turning the car around. "No, Dad, please don't." I grabbed his arm. "It's not worth it. I just want to leave." He looked at me for a long time, and then, to my surprise, he nodded. "You're right. Let's go home." We went to see him, and as it turned out, over the years he had learned how to cook a pretty decent pasta. We ate right out of the pan, sitting at the kitchen table, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't have to hold my breath. I didn't have to control my every move. I didn't have to be afraid to say the wrong word. And then he threw another bomb. "Do you remember that contract for a car park that I told you about?" "What is it?" he asked between 2 sips of soda. I nodded. "Well, I got it. Exclusive maintenance for their entire fleet." I was genuinely happy for him, but I must have looked depressed, because he looked at me carefully and added, "And you know what else? I've been saving up for years. I saved everything I could for your college." I froze, the fork froze in my hand. "What?" "It's not enough for an Ivy League school, but combined with your scholarships, I think it's enough for you." I almost choked on the pasta. You saved up for my college?" He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Of course, princess. Did you really think I'd let Richard be right about me?" For the first time in a long time, I cried, but they weren't tears of despair, pain, or loneliness. They were tears of happiness, relief, and gratitude. All these years, I've been trying to protect my dad from my problems, hiding how hard it was for me, how I was being pushed out of my own home, how my mom looked at me like I was a burden, but all this time he was quietly planning my future, saving money so that I would have a chance to escape and start living my life. With my life. I decided not to tell my mom about my college, not to share the news, not to give her or her ideal family a single chance to ruin what I had now. Let them think they've won, let them think I've disappeared from their lives. It's even better that way. I spent that summer living with my dad and working at the Bean Coffee shop in the city center. It was a small but cozy place, always saturated with the aroma of freshly ground coffee and vanilla syrup, with walls hung with black and white photographs of old streets and wooden tables where office workers gathered in the morning and students with laptops in the evening. I wanted to save up some money, even though I knew Dad would always help, but it was important for me to feel independent. One day after lunch, the doorbell rang, and without looking up from the register, I automatically muttered, "Welcome to Bean, choose what you like." And then I heard a voice that made my stomach clench. Well, Sarah drawled, loud enough for all the nearby customers to hear her. "It looks like someone has found their true calling." I turned around and saw them both, Sarah and Emma, dressed as if they were heading to a fashion show rather than a simple coffee shop. They had settled into a corner booth, in my section, of course, and now they were looking at me with the same expression I remembered from childhood, a mixture of contempt and complacency. "Yeah, we just wanted to see how the other half lives before we go to college in the fall," Emma giggled, studying the menu with feigned indifference. "Dad has already selected ideal schools for us." I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to roll my eyes, and pulled out my notebook. "Can I accept your order?" I kept my voice level, professional, and even allowed myself a small, polite smile. "Oh, you'll probably still be here pouring coffee when we graduate," Sarah said dreamily, looking at her manicured nails. "But don't worry, maybe we'll even leave you a nice tip when we get home." I just smiled and wrote down their complicated orders for semi-hot drinks with a mixture of rare syrups that they probably wouldn't have distinguished from each other. Let them have their moment. Let them think they've won. They didn't even realize that in the fall I would go to college in a neighboring state, start a new life that they would never know about. And so it turned out. I went to college, immersed myself in my studies, made friends, and learned to enjoy the freedom I had been deprived of for so long. Over the years, Mom has never called, texted, tried to apologize, or even just to find out how I'm doing. I haven't called her either. She chose her family. And I chose mine. Dad visited me whenever he could, and we talked almost every day. I saw how his business grew, how he turned his workshop into a real company, and I was more proud of him than he could ever have imagined. For years flew by. I graduated with honors and almost immediately got a job at a marketing firm in the same city where my college was. The initial salary wasn't too high, but it was enough to rent a small apartment and live comfortably. I worked a lot, stayed late, took on additional projects, and my boss noticed it. My promotion started almost immediately, first as a junior manager, then as a senior manager, then as a team leader, and with each step my salary got higher. For the first time in my life I had real savings. And then one evening, Dad knocked on my door. Did I forget something? I asked, looking at him in surprise as he came inside, smiling broadly, and sat down at my kitchen table. No, I just wanted to share some news. He took a check out of his pocket and unfolded it on the table. Here, look. I bent over and stared at the amount. My vision went dark. Dad, I couldn't even say it. It's for the down payment on your own apartment, he said simply. You've worked so hard, princess. You deserve it. 2 months later, I was moving into my own apartment. Not removable. It's. A year later, a new promotion, even more raises, even more opportunities. I started thinking about buying a house. Something with a garden, maybe in one of those quiet suburban areas where you can safely go out on the porch with a cup of coffee and not hear a single sound except birdsong. One evening, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it seemed alarmingly familiar, and when I answered, hearing an uncertain voice on the other end, my stomach clenched. Jacqueline. I froze. That's Mom. My heart skipped a beat. I think it's time for us to talk, she paused, and I felt her gather her courage. I want to try to settle the relationship between us. I didn't know what I expected from this day, but when I heard it, for some reason I wasn't surprised. There was no anger, no despair, just a dull, incomprehensible emptiness inside. Okay, I said, and my voice sounded calmer than I really felt. Let's talk. We agreed to meet in a small cafe in the city center, on neutral territory, where no one would feel like a stranger. I came earlier, ordered myself a glass of water, and while I was waiting, I tried to sort out the feelings that were rising in me. When Mom came in, I barely recognized her. She looked older, tired, her eyes didn't have the same gleam of confidence. The woman who once chose her new family, cutting me out of her life, was gone. You look wonderful, she said, sitting down across from him, and her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted the napkin. We awkwardly talked about the weather and my job until the waitress brought us coffee, and only then did Mom take a deep breath, stared into her cup, and finally spoke. I left Richard. I didn't answer, just waited, letting her talk at her own pace. Or rather, he left me, she corrected with a bitter smile. After we mortgaged the house to pay for the girls' college. I felt something cold run down my spine, but I didn't interrupt her. They promised they'd help with the payments after graduation, Mom smiled weakly. But when the time came, they always had excuses. Either the job market was difficult, or they needed to focus on their careers, or they had their own expenses. She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. We lost the house, her voice cracked. All these years of payments, and nothing. And Richard. She swallowed hard. He just packed up and moved in with Sarah. He said he couldn't handle the financial stress anymore. I opened my mouth, but she raised her hand, interrupting me. Please let me finish. I stopped talking. I was wrong, Jacqueline. I chose them, not you. I let them hurt you. I hurt you myself. And I'm so sorry. The tears in her eyes were real. The tremor in her voice was real. And despite everything, despite all the years of pain, rejection, and alienation, I suddenly realized that I didn't feel angry. I slowly reached across the table and squeezed her hand lightly. I forgive you, I said softly, surprised at how sincere those words turned out to be. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation, about my mom, lonely and homeless after she gave everything to people who didn't give her anything in return. It was like a punishment, but it didn't bring me joy. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and opportunity, a chance to do the right thing, a chance to be more than just a hurt daughter. On Wednesday evening, I called her again. I was thinking about buying a house, I said after we exchanged greetings. Something in the old neighborhood, with a garden. Maybe it will be too big for me alone, but maybe you will want to live there. She was silent for so long that I even looked at the phone screen to see if the connection was broken. Are you serious? What is it? She whispered at last. Yes, Mother. I took a week off and flew home to look for a house. I found a place that I liked right away, nothing special, but cozy, with a porch encircling the facade, tall old trees in the courtyard, quiet neighbors, and the smell of lilacs in the morning. Mom was crying when she saw him. When Dad found out about my decision, I expected him to be upset, but he just shook his head and, to my surprise, smiled. You have a bigger heart than most, Princess, he said, hugging me tightly. I'm proud of you. The next few months went into a pleasant routine. I flew in for the weekend, first spent time with my dad, and then went to my new home with my mom. We were slowly but surely rebuilding our relationship, and every day she became a little happier, a little calmer, a little more like the mother I remembered from childhood. During one of my visits, I noticed some unfamiliar things in the house. A pair of men's shoes were standing by the door, a carelessly thrown off jacket was hanging in the hallway, as if the owner had come in for a short time, not caring about the order. I frowned at these alien objects, and couldn't help but ask. Mom, does someone live with you? Oh, just a visiting friend, she replied too quickly, turning to the stove as if she were looking for salvation there. You know how it is, I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe I should have paid attention. Maybe I should have called. On Tuesday morning, as I was getting ready for work, my phone vibrated, flashing Aunt Carol's number. I was surprised. We didn't call each other often, and when I answered, something in her voice made me freeze. Jacqueline, dear, she said, and from the careful way she chose her words, I knew the news was going to be bad. There's something you need to know. It's about your mother. Is she all right? My heart started beating faster. Yes, she's fine. It's just. Jacqueline, Richard lives in this house. The room became quiet, as if the whole world had shrunk into one point. What? I gasped, clutching the phone until my knuckles turned white. Him and his daughters, Carol paused, as if giving me time to process what she'd just heard. They moved in a few months ago. It's impossible. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. I was there just 2 weeks ago, and it was just Mom. Because she makes them leave before your visits, my aunt explained softly but firmly. They're getting out, pretending they're not there. But I found out from a neighbor, she's been noticing how they come and go for a long time. And then everything fell into place. Shoes, jacket, Mom's strange behavior, her indecision, evasive answers. All these small details, which I stubbornly ignored, suddenly formed into one frightening pattern. I didn't think twice. I thanked Carol, hung up the phone, and immediately booked the first flight home. No warning, no calls. I just grabbed my laptop. Thankfully, I was working remotely, and headed to the airport. Wednesday. The day I drove up to the house in a rented car, feeling my heart racing. Richard's old pickup truck was parked in the driveway, the same one he had years ago when I lived here and hated every day. My key turned smoothly in the lock. The picture that unfolded in front of me in the kitchen seemed to have escaped from the past, from my teenage years, from the time that I wanted to forget. Mom was at the stove, in her favorite apron, fussing over a pot, from where the smell of stewed meat wafted, the very one that Richard loved. Sarah and Emma were sitting at the kitchen table, just as they once were, with smug smiles, as if nothing had changed. And Richard settled into his usual armchair, leisurely reading the newspaper, as if all these years had never happened, as if we were back in the old house, where I was always superfluous. Mom noticed me first. The wooden spoon fell out of her hands with a clatter, and I saw her face turn pale. "Jacqueline," she whispered, nervously grabbing the edge of the table. I wasn't expecting you until Saturday." "I see," I replied, amazed at how even my voice remained. "What are they doing here?" "We live here now," Sarah announced with a grin, leaning back in her chair. "Mom invited us." She realized that the family must stick together. I slowly turned my gaze to my mother. "Family?" My heart sank. She was awkwardly wiping her hands on her apron, avoiding my gaze. "After everything they've done to you?" There was steel in his voice. "After they dragged you into debt, deprived you of your home? Have they ever apologized?" "There." Mom lowered her eyes. "They're trying to fix everything. Richard has changed. The girls have changed. Take them away." I cut her off, and now my voice was no longer steady. It sounded like anger, the same one that had been accumulating in me for years. "Right now. This is my home. I don't want them to stay here." Mom straightened up abruptly, and the familiar stubborn gleam flashed in her eyes. "I love them, and I want them to be here." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. "Do you love them?" The words were too soft, but with every passing second, a hurricane was rising inside me. "They got you into debt, ruined your life. Have you forgotten how they treated me? How was I bullied every single day? How did they destroy my things, steal my room, turn my life into hell?" Mom blinked, as if she just realized how loud I was talking. "Jacqueline." But I couldn't stop. "I took you to this house because I hoped that we had a chance to fix everything, that I could help you," my hands clenched into fists. "But if you choose them again." I didn't finish. I couldn't. The air in the house felt heavy and sticky, and I could feel panic building inside me, my heart pounding too fast. I took a step back, as if I needed to physically distance myself from this scene, from these people who shouldn't be here, and from my mother, who, once again, chose them over me. "That was many years ago," Mom waved her hand dismissively, as if trying to dispel the shadow of the past like unnecessary smoke. "They were just kids." "What about now?" I didn't look away, feeling anger and frustration rising inside me with renewed vigor. "They used you to pay for their college, and then they dumped you, and Richard dumped you when things got tough. How can you just forgive that?" "Because they're my family," Mom repeated stubbornly, straightening her back and lifting her chin, as if she was going to defend her choice to the last. "They made mistakes, but now they regret it." Sarah and Emma exchanged smug glances. Their smiles were all too familiar, the same ones I remembered from childhood, when they found a new way to ruin my life. Richard was just sitting in an armchair, not looking up from the newspaper, but I saw the corners of his mouth twitch in a condescending smile, the same one that he once greeted all my attempts to defend myself. "Great," my voice was icy. "Then I'll give you a choice, Mom. Right now. It's them or me." The silence that followed seemed like an eternity. I looked into her face, searching for something in those familiar features, even the slightest glimmer of the woman who once braided my hair, kissed my bruised knees, and whispered before going to sleep that I could become anyone. I choose them, she finally said. A week of happiness together, Jacqueline, why can't you just accept it? Something inside me snapped. You have 2 days to get out of my house. All of you. You can't do this. Mom's voice rose to a hysterical scream. I'm your mother. You can't kick me out. I looked her straight in the eye. Watch me. I turned around and walked out, feeling their voices following me, as the door slammed shut behind me, separating me from the past, which I was no longer going to tolerate. 2 days later, I returned. Nothing has changed. Their cars were still parked in the driveway, and when I walked in, they were sitting in the living room like they owned the place. I told you to leave, I said calmly. Mom leaned back in her chair and laughed. And I told you that you can't kick me out, she smiled, and for a moment it seemed to me that in front of me again was the woman who, in my distant childhood, held me close, promising that she would always be there for me. But that was a long time ago. Great. I took out my phone, dialed 911, and, holding the receiver to my ear, said coldly, Then I'll let the police explain to you. Richard started to get up from his chair, his face contorted with rage. You wouldn't dare. Hi, yes, I need help removing unauthorized tenants from my property. My voice was steady, confident, and I clearly stated the address, watching as my mother's gaze darted between me and the phone. What happened next was disgusting. The police arrived a few minutes later. Mom screamed and cried while the officers calmly explained to her that yes, I could evict them, and no, she had no legal right to stay here. Richard turned purple with anger. His insults rained down one after another, but it didn't bother me anymore. Sarah and Emma were trying to maintain their arrogance, but I could see their ostentatious confidence fading by the minute. You're ungrateful. Mom screamed when the police took them out the door. After all I've done for you. I watched them load their stuff into the cars. Everything you've done for me? I shook my head and looked at her coldly. Name one thing, Mom. Just the one thing you've done for me since the day you married him. She didn't answer. Aunt Carol keeps me posted, even though I never ask. They live in a small apartment on the other side of the city, barely able to keep up with the rent. Richard has never been able to hold down a job. Sarah and Emma have long been estranged. They have their own lives, too full to take care of their mother, who sacrificed everything for them. Sometimes Mom calls. Late at night. But I never answer. The house is empty most of the time. I often think about selling it, maybe buying something closer to the city where I live now. Something smaller, more comfortable. Something that doesn't carry any echoes of the past.